My name is Ethan Walker, and I never imagined a simple disagreement with my HOA would turn into a six-figure nightmare. It started when a newly elected HOA board, led by a woman everyone in the neighborhood quietly called Karen, decided my property had become their personal target. Within weeks, I received violation notices for things that had been perfectly acceptable for years. Then came the shock that left me staring at the letter in disbelief, a staggering $110,000 in fines. Bro, when I first saw that number, I genuinely thought it had to be a typo. The board expected me to panic, pay up, or surrender. Instead, their obsession with control pushed them into making mistakes they never saw coming. What began as a campaign to force me out of the neighborhood slowly unraveled into one of the most satisfying examples of karma I have ever witnessed. And the craziest part? Just weeks later, the very board that fined me resigned. I had lived in the neighborhood for almost 12 years, and until this entire mess started, I barely thought about the HOA. Like most people, I paid the dues, kept my property maintained, and went about my life. My house sat on one of the larger lots in the community, and over the years I had invested a lot of time and money into improving it. I added a detached workshop behind the house, landscaped parts of the yard, installed a backup generator, and even built a small storage structure that matched the design of the home. Every project had either been approved years earlier or had existed long before the current HOA board took power. That is what made what happened next so unbelievable. 2. Everything changed after the annual HOA election. A group of new board members came in promising stricter enforcement and community standards. At first, most residents didn't pay much attention. We had heard similar promises before. But within a month, violation notices started appearing throughout the neighborhood like confetti. People received warnings for mailbox colors, flower beds, basketball hoops, and even outdoor furniture arrangements. It felt less like community management and more like a competition to see who could issue the most citations. At the center of it all was the board president, a woman named Linda. She quickly earned a reputation for constantly patrolling the neighborhood, taking photographs of homes, and sending violation letters over the smallest issues imaginable. Neighbors started joking that she spent more time watching security cameras than enjoying her own property. Looking back, those jokes weren't far from reality. Then my notices started arriving. The first letter claimed my workshop violated community guidelines despite being nearly a decade old. The second alleged that my generator enclosure was not properly documented. The third claimed my storage structure exceeded allowable dimensions. Every time I responded with old approvals, permits, and records, another violation somehow appeared. It felt like playing a game where the rules changed every time I proved I was right. What really caught my attention was how selective the enforcement seemed to be. Other homes had identical structures, similar improvements, and comparable setups, yet they weren't receiving fines. Several neighbors quietly admitted they had the same features I was being cited for. That's exactly how these situations often unfold in real life. Rules suddenly become very important when someone wants leverage over a specific person. 3. Over the following months, the letters multiplied. Certified mail became a regular part of my week. The HOA accused me of unresolved violations, administrative non-compliance, inspection failures, and various technical infractions buried deep inside governing documents that most homeowners had never even read. Every notice carried larger penalties than the one before it. I kept meticulous records. Every email, every photograph, every approval letter, every invoice, every permit. Something about the board's behavior felt off. The intensity didn't match the circumstances. Normal enforcement usually aims to solve problems. This felt personal. Then the fines started accumulating at an alarming rate. $5,000 became $10,000. $10,000 became $25,000. Administrative fees appeared. Additional penalties appeared. Interest appeared. By the time I received the certified envelope that would change everything, the HOA had spent months building a paper mountain against me. I remember opening that letter at my kitchen table and reading the total again and again because my brain simply refused to process it. According to the board, I now owed $110,000 in violations and penalties. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't about compliance anymore. The HOA wasn't trying to correct anything. They were trying to break me. The moment that $110,000 fine landed on my kitchen table, something shifted. Up until then, I had treated the situation like a misunderstanding that could eventually be resolved through documentation and patience. But nobody accidentally fines a homeowner $110,000. That kind of number isn't a mistake. It's a message. The board wanted me overwhelmed, intimidated, and desperate enough to give up. Instead, their actions pushed me into doing something they never expected. I started digging. For the first thing I did was compare my violation notices with the community guidelines. Then I compared them with county records, past HOA approvals, and old board meeting minutes. The deeper I looked, the stranger everything became. Some of the violations referenced rules that had been amended years earlier. Others cited standards that weren't even being enforced throughout the neighborhood. Bro, hearing that just blew my mind. It was like the board had assembled a case against me by pulling random pieces from different versions of the rulebook. Meanwhile, word about the fine spread through the neighborhood. At first, people approached me quietly. A neighbor would stop while walking their dog. Someone else would knock on my door after dark. Several homeowners admitted they were afraid to speak publicly because they had already received warnings themselves. But once they saw the size of the fine, fear slowly turned into outrage. Even residents who normally supported strict HOA enforcement thought the penalty was absurd. Then came the discovery that changed everything. While reviewing public records and board communications, I noticed something that didn't add up. Certain enforcement decisions appeared to have been made outside official meetings. Important votes were missing from meeting minutes. Documentation that should have existed simply wasn't there. The more questions I asked, the more defensive the board became. Requests for records were delayed. Responses became vague. Suddenly, people who had ignored me for months were scrambling to control information. That was when I realized the board had made a critical mistake. In their rush to target me, they had left behind a trail of inconsistencies that couldn't be easily explained. And once other homeowners started looking at that trail too, the HOA's entire foundation began to crack. Once I realized the board's paperwork didn't add up, I stopped focusing solely on defending myself and started documenting every inconsistency I could find. What began as a few questionable records quickly turned into a mountain of evidence. Missing votes. Contradictory meeting minutes. Enforcement actions that appeared to have been approved without proper procedures. The more I organized everything, the clearer the pattern became. The board had spent so much energy targeting me that they had become careless. At the same time, homeowners throughout the neighborhood were becoming increasingly frustrated. Stories started surfacing that sounded disturbingly familiar. One resident had received repeated warnings over a landscaping issue that had supposedly been approved years earlier. Another had been threatened with penalties for a modification that matched dozens of other homes. For months people had assumed they were isolated cases. Now they were beginning to realize they were all experiencing variations of the same problem. The upcoming HOA meeting suddenly became the most anticipated gathering the neighborhood had seen in years. When the evening arrived, the room was packed. Homeowners filled every available seat, with many standing along the walls. You could feel the tension before the meeting even began. Everyone knew something significant was about to happen. The board members sat at the front of the room projecting confidence, but even from across the room I could tell they were uneasy. They had spent months controlling the narrative. Tonight they were about to lose that control. As the meeting progressed, residents began asking questions. At first they were simple requests for clarification. Then they became more specific. Homeowners wanted explanations for missing records, inconsistent enforcement, and unexplained decisions. The board's answers grew increasingly defensive. Every response seemed to create 2 new questions. Then came my turn. 6. I presented a carefully organized timeline showing how the violations against my property had evolved. I matched notices against prior approvals, meeting records, governing documents, and public filings. Instead of arguing emotionally, I simply laid out the facts. One inconsistency led to another. One missing approval led to another. One unexplained action led to another. The room became quieter with every page. I genuinely couldn't believe how quickly the atmosphere changed. The board members who had spent months portraying themselves as unquestionable authorities suddenly looked completely unprepared. Homeowners began comparing notes in real time. Several residents stood up and described similar experiences. Others questioned why certain properties had been targeted while others had been ignored. What was supposed to be a routine meeting transformed into hours of scrutiny. By the end of the night, the conversation was no longer about my alleged violations. Nobody cared about the $110,000 fine anymore. The focus had shifted entirely to the conduct of the board itself. The power dynamic that had dominated the neighborhood for months had completely reversed. And once that happened, the board's downfall became impossible to stop. The weeks following that meeting felt surreal. For months, the HOA board had operated as though its authority could never be questioned. Now, homeowners were demanding answers almost daily. Requests for records poured in. Independent reviews were discussed. Residents who had stayed silent for years suddenly felt comfortable speaking up. Once people realized they weren't alone, the fear that had protected the board began to disappear. The first major development came when my $110,000 fine was formally reviewed. As the supporting documentation was examined more closely, problems started appearing everywhere. Several penalties lacked clear justification. Other charges appeared to be based on disputed interpretations of rules. 7. Some of the enforcement actions that had been used to build the total amount became increasingly difficult to defend. One by one, portions of the fine began falling apart. Then the resignations started. At first it was one board member citing personal reasons. A few days later, another stepped down. Then another. That's exactly how these situations often unfold in real life. People are eager to share authority when everything looks successful, but once accountability arrives, suddenly nobody wants ownership of the decisions. Within a matter of weeks, most of the individuals responsible for the enforcement campaign were gone. The board that had spent months threatening homeowners was effectively dismantled. My fine was withdrawn, the violations were closed, and new leadership moved in promising transparency and consistency. After everything that had happened, walking to my mailbox without expecting another threatening letter felt like a victory all by itself. Looking back, the craziest part wasn't the $110,000 fine. It was how quickly people in positions of power can convince themselves they're untouchable. The board spent so much time trying to pressure one homeowner that they completely ignored the rules they were supposed to enforce. Bro, that part was unbelievable. What started as an attempt to break me ultimately exposed the very people behind the campaign. That's exactly why transparency matters. In the end, the fines disappeared, the board resigned, and the neighborhood moved forward. The karma wasn't loud or dramatic. It arrived in the form of accountability, and honestly, that was far more satisfying. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more unbelievable HOA, revenge, karma, and entitled neighbor stories. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if someone tried to fine you $110,000 over questionable violations?